He wasn't chasing anything, just riding to forget. But when the cowboy spotted 3 men by the tracks, laughing too loud, something felt wrong. That's when he saw her, tied down, silent, eyes wide like the desert sky. He cut the ropes, but she didn't run. Instead, she pulled out a weathered journal with a signature that could destroy a railroad empire. Now they're not just escaping. They're uncovering a buried truth, one that could save sacred land or cost them everything. Will the past speak loud enough to stop the iron? The map in her hands holds more than routes. It holds a promise. The wind ran dry that day. No scent of rain, just dust in the teeth and the faint iron tang of rail steel baking under sun. The cowboy didn't have a name worth remembering anymore. Folks used to call him Luke, but out here near Cinder Butte, names had a way of blowing off like ash in a campfire. He rode alone, his saddle worn to smooth leather, and his eyes too tired to care what came next. But when he crested the ridge near Dry Bend, his horse snorted and stopped cold. Below, at a half-laid rail curve, 3 men lounged near a fire. Their laughter rose sharp and ugly, the kind that didn't come from joy, only cruelty. One of them tossed a whiskey bottle toward the track, where something lay stretched and unmoving. Luke narrowed his eyes. Tied to the rail, limp, dust-covered, and barely conscious, was a girl, a young native girl. Hands bound tight, ankle twisted at an ugly angle, mouth smeared with blood and dirt. She didn't scream, didn't even blink, just stared past the sun. Luke didn't think, he moved. He rode down the slope fast and crooked, letting the loose rocks give him cover. From the far side of the fire, he drew his rifle and fired one shot, high, just above the heads of the men. The crack split the canyon like thunder. They scattered, yelling curses and falling over their own boots. One tripped into the fire. Another fumbled his holster but didn't have the nerve to aim. They scrambled like jackrabbits, vanishing into the scrub. Luke dismounted slow, careful not to spook the girl. She didn't flinch when he knelt beside her. The cords around her wrists had cut deep. Her ankle was already swelling. He took out his knife, cut her loose, and helped her sit upright. Still, she didn't speak. "Can you walk?" he asked, voice low. She looked at her ankle, then at him. "No," she said, "but I can ride." He nodded once, admiring her grit. He helped her onto his horse, hoisting her gently. She gritted her teeth, but didn't make a sound. They rode through the dry wash, the rail line disappearing behind them, silent except for the wind and the slow clip of hooves. The sun sank hard and low, painting the red cliffs like blood on sandstone. At dusk, Luke stopped near a crooked mesquite tree and set up camp. He gave her water, tore his sleeve into strips, and wrapped her ankle as best he could. She sat still through it all, watching him like she was weighing every move he made. "Name's Luke," he offered. She didn't return the courtesy. Instead, she stared at the dirt beneath them. Then her gaze lifted, sharp, steady. "Do you know what land we're standing on?" she asked. Luke looked around. "Rail land. Used to be tribal. Now it's still tribal," she cut in. "The treaties just got smaller. Not the truth." She pulled something from inside her coat, a small leather-bound journal, wrapped in cloth. The edges were worn, the spine cracked. She didn't open it, just held it tight. Luke didn't press. He poured 2 cups of coffee from his battered tin pot and passed one to her. They sat side by side, a fire crackling low between them. "You got folks?" he asked. She sipped slow. "Had." That was all she said. When the stars broke out, cold and sharp against the black, she lay back on the ground and slept with one hand resting on the journal like it was more than pages, like it was a grave marker or a weapon. Luke watched the flames. He'd saved folks before, usually from themselves. But this girl, she wasn't asking for saving. She was riding toward something, and something told him if he didn't ride with her, someone else would tie her down again. So in the morning, when she winced stepping near her horse, he held the reins and said only this: "I'll ride till your ankle heals. After that, you ride where you need." She nodded once. Neither of them said thank you. Some debts are older than words, and some trails don't need names to matter. The wind shifted by mid-morning, dry as ever, but carrying a strange scent, like crushed sage and gun oil. Luke noticed it before they broke camp. The girl, Lonnie, he'd learned only by overhearing her whisper to her horse, was already awake, chewing bitter leaves and rubbing them on the gelding's gums. "What's that for?" he asked, tightening his saddle straps. Calms his heart, she said. He knows more than I do sometimes. Luke didn't doubt it. That horse hadn't made a sound when he rode up yesterday, not even when she was tied to the track, steady like she was, too steady for a girl who'd nearly died. They rode quiet through the high ravine trail, letting the cliffs shield them from the horizon. Lonnie kept glancing at the rocks, sometimes stopping to press her palm to the soil, like she could hear something underneath. Luke didn't ask, not yet. He was good at waiting, one of the few virtues time had carved into him. Midway down a dried creek bed, he finally broke the silence. You said this land's still tribal. You mean Red Mesa? She gave him a sharp look, measuring the question. Creed calls it Red Mesa. We call it Tso-a-Ninil-gai, place of echoes. Luke whistled low. That railroad's headed straight through it. I know, she said. That's why they're chasing me. Her voice was flat, but something beneath it buzzed, like heat rising off rail steel. Luke slowed his horse. The men from yesterday? They weren't drunks, she said. They work for Silas Creed. That name turned Luke's stomach. Silas Creed, rail baron, land, swindler, and silver-tongued devil in a vest. He'd bought up half the Cinder Butte territory through bribes and bogus claims. Folks said he could lay track through your front door and charge you rent to leave. What's he want with you? Luke asked, more careful now. Lonnie didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in deerskin. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small journal, same one from the firelight. But now open to a faded page, ink barely holding its lines. Luke leaned in. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Silas Creed. Treaty, Lonnie said. My mother got him to sign it 5 years ago. Promised to reroute the tracks to spare the sacred site. In exchange, the tribe would allow freight rights through the South Valley. She kept her end. But he didn't, Luke muttered. Lonnie nodded once. When she died, he claimed she mistranslated, that there was no written proof, said the journal was personal, unofficial. And the sheriff? Paid off, she said. So is the judge. Last month they said I forged it, claimed I broke into Creed's records. I've got a $500 bounty on my head. Luke looked at her, truly looked. She couldn't have been more than 20, maybe younger, and yet she sat there, saddle-worn and straight-backed, holding the last piece of her mother's promise like it weighed more than a rifle. Why didn't you run farther? He asked. Why circle back here? Because I know where Creed plans to lay the golden spike, she said. They'll make it official at the founders' picnic. They'll bless it, celebrate it, and bury what's left of our land beneath speeches and whiskey. Luke didn't answer. He just pulled the reins, turned his horse west, and started riding. Lonnie blinked. Where are you going? He glanced back. You ride better with both ankles, and you're not going to outrun hired guns with a notebook. But maybe, just maybe, there's more than one way to lay a trap. Lonnie watched him go, then urged her gelding forward. They didn't ride fast. They didn't ride loud. But behind them, the wind carried a whisper through the canyon, low and unsettled. The railroad may have brought steel. But some stories ride on paper, and some truths echo louder than dynamite. By dusk, the sky had faded to ash. Luke guided them into a narrow canyon west of Cinder Butte, a place he'd slept in once during a bitter winter, and remembered not for the shelter, but for its silence. The red walls rose steep and tight around them, shutting out the wind and casting long shadows over the rocky floor. It was a place forgotten, even by deer. Lonnie dismounted slow, careful not to put pressure on her injured ankle. She didn't complain, just reached into her saddlebag and began sorting dried herbs, grinding them with a flat stone and a steady hand. Luke gathered brush for a fire but didn't light it. The canyon walls held enough heat to keep them warm, and he figured light wasn't their friend tonight. Creed's men were likely crawling these hills by now. As they settled into the hush, Luke finally asked, "How'd your mother get Creed to sign that treaty?" Lonnie paused, the pestle in her hand stilled. Then, like a floodgate cracking, the story came. She was a negotiator, she said, not just for our tribe, but for 3 others. When the rail first came, she offered Creed a compromise: access through the South Valley, safe passage, grazing rights untouched. In exchange, Red Mesa would be off-limits, too sacred, too dangerous to disturb. Luke nodded. He'd heard stories about that mesa, strange echoes, lights flickering without flame, horses refusing to step on certain ground. Creed agreed, Lonnie continued. Signed it himself in front of two witnesses. One was my uncle, the other, the sheriff who now pretends he never saw it. What changed? My mother died, she said simply. There was no tremble in her voice, just the edge of something honed too long, grief shaped into resolve. How? Luke asked. Lonnie's jaw worked before she answered. They said fever, but she was strong, never sick a day in her life. Then, sudden and gone. That same week, Creed announced a new route, straight through the mesa. She unwrapped the journal again, flipping to a page Luke hadn't seen. There, tucked between entries, was a loose paper, faint fingerprints smudged across it. The words were formal, inked carefully. This is the clause, she said. It names Red Mesa explicitly, and that any breach voids the agreement, and all mineral rights. Luke whistled low. That had cost Creed millions. Exactly, she said. That's why he buried it, bribed the judge, put a bounty on me. Luke stared at the paper. It was real, precise. Nothing about it smelled like forgery. You ever try taking it to the federal office? He asked. I got as far as Albuquerque, she said, but Creed has eyes there too. That's where I was framed. Said I broke into his rail yard. They burned my satchel. Journal only survived because I'd wrapped it in oilcloth. Luke nodded, his hands tightening, around his coffee tin. He'd run from a lot of things in life. Responsibility, memory, even love. But this wasn't a runaway story. It was a buried one. And he hated things buried alive. You think they'll follow us this far? He asked. They don't need to, she said. They'll wait. Creed wants a show. He's planning to drive a golden spike into Red Mesa next week. Town picnic, speeches, photographers. That's when he'll pretend this land never mattered. Luke sat quiet for a moment. Then, what if we beat him to the stage? Lonnie looked at him. I mean it, he said. What if we don't run? What if we make sure the truth gets seen by the whole town? She narrowed her eyes, cautious. You'd risk that? For someone you met yesterday? He met her gaze without flinching. You weren't just tied to those tracks. Creed tied a lie there too. I don't plan on letting it ride. For the first time, something shifted in her face. Not a smile, but a flicker. Recognition, respect. She passed him the journal. Then, we'd better start planning. They sat there, two strangers under redstone and twilight, holding between them a secret that could topple empires, not with bullets, but with ink, and memory, and the kind of truth that rattles louder than iron. By the time Luke and Lonnie reached the outskirts of Cinder Butte, the town was humming with celebration. Bunting hung from balconies like limp prairie flowers, and streamers fluttered over Main Street, where merchants pushed out barrels of cider and children chased ribbons on sticks. It was Founders Day, the kind of event Creed loved. He didn't just build railroads, he built ceremonies to bury the past in applause. Luke adjusted his hat low over his brow, his rough coat hiding the dusty pistol tucked at his hip. Lonnie had wrapped her hair in a kerchief, dressed in a borrowed skirt from a friend in the hills, and limped with practiced subtlety. Her eyes, though, missed nothing. Too many uniforms, she murmured as they passed the livery stable. Luke nodded. Creed brought muscle dressed as order. Their plan wasn't to confront Creed, not yet. Today was for watching, listening, and confirming what they feared. They split up near the bakery, Luke trailing toward the saloon where deals were brokered in whispers, and Lonnie heading toward the new platform under construction at the north edge of town. It was there she saw it. A temporary stage, draped in red and white, with a polished plaque reading, Future Site of the Golden Spike. Red Mesa Extension, just below, men hammered spikes into ceremonial ties while investors snapped photographs. Creed stood at the center of it all, smiling like he already owned tomorrow. Lonnie ducked behind a barrel and pulled her notebook. Her hand trembled slightly as she sketched the layout. The platform, the guards' patrols, the distance to the canyon rim behind the site. It was muscle memory. Planning gave her control. But as she turned to leave, her breath caught. A man leaned against the bridge scaffolding, uniformed, dusty but unmistakable, black hat, silver badge, long scar down his cheek. U.S. Marshal Garrick Haynes. Her stomach flipped. He was older now, but she'd never forget the way he gripped her mother's arm the night they came for the journal. Claimed she was forging federal documents. He had dragged her through the village square while Lonnie, barely 15, had watched helpless from behind a corral post. Her fingers clenched. For a moment, the canyon of memory opened too wide. "You all right?" a voice whispered behind her. She turned. "Luke, found you at the end of your trail," he said quietly. "Did you see it?" "Creed's laying it out like scripture," she said, voice low. "And Haynes is here." Luke's jaw worked. "The marshal?" She nodded. "He helped bury my mother's truth. Now he's guarding the lie." Luke looked past the stage, studying the platform. "You still want to do this?" "I don't want to," she said, "but I have to." He looked at her, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased at the corners, ink faded. "Got this from a freight clerk I used to play cards with. Creed's manifest. Lists the spike, the platform, the guards, and the exact time this'll be here next week." She took it, scanning fast. "We can reroute his escort." "That's the idea," Luke said. "Give us time to get what we need to the recorder's office, and maybe lay a trap of our own." Lonnie smiled. Small, sharp, like the edge of a blade finely honed. "Then let's ride." As they slipped out of town, fireworks cracked in the sky behind them. Folks cheered, oblivious to the rot beneath the ribboned celebration. Creed lifted a glass on stage, eyes sweeping the crowd. He didn't see the two riders melting into the dusk. He didn't see the map in Lonnie's hand, or the copy of his own signature folded in Luke's pocket. But he would. Because lies don't last long in a town where the land remembers. And tomorrow, the earth would speak. They rode hard after nightfall, following dry washes and mule paths known, mostly to goats and ghosts. The moon hung low and orange behind them, bleeding through the cottonwoods like fire through gauze. Luke's horse was flagging, but he didn't let up till the lights of Valencia Ridge winked into view, the last outpost before the county line. "Clerk's office opens at sunup," he told Lonnie, voice coarse from dust. "But I know the man who keeps the keys." The town was quiet, a rail stop with 2 saloons and a boarding house sagging into its own shadow. Luke dismounted outside the recorder's shack and knocked once, then twice, slow. After a pause, the door creaked open. "Lord above," came a sleepy growl. "If it ain't Luke Branner." "Evening, Eli. You still got that weak eye and stronger sense of fairness?" Eli Hall squinted through a smudge-covered lens. "Depends who's askin'." Luke handed over the folded treaty page. The old clerk took it, lit a lamp, and studied the signature, his brows arched. "Well, I'll be." "We need a certified copy," Luke said. "Fast and quiet." Eli rubbed his jaw. "Creed's men came through here 2 weeks ago, said anyone helping a girl named Lonnie could be considered aiding a fugitive." Lonnie stepped forward. "That's me." Eli's mouth twisted. "You got grit, miss. Your mother once brought me tobacco when my boy was sick. I owe her that much." He opened the office door wider. "Come in." By sunrise, they had it, a fresh document with the county seal, dated and signed in Eli's cautious hand. Lonnie rolled it carefully, then tucked it in a hollowed-out canteen beneath her saddle blanket. From there, the second part of their plan kicked in. Using Creed's own manifest, they penned a forged telegram, rerouting his armed escorts to a fictitious sabotage site 30 miles east, an old ore chute known for rattlesnakes and ghosts. Lonnie's penmanship mimicked the station master's near perfectly. "Think they'll bite?" she asked. "Creed's men are paid, not smart," Luke said. "They'll ride where the gold is." By the second night, they were back near Red Mesa, hidden beneath the canyon's overhang. Stars blinked down like silent witnesses as they buried the original treaty in a cairn beneath the wooden platform Creed's crew had raised. Lonnie wrapped it in wax cloth and tucked it in a brass tobacco tin sealed with twine. Luke watched her, then said quietly, "Why here?" "Because this bridge is built on a lie," she said, "and the truth belongs underneath it." They scattered fresh gravel over the disturbed ground and laid a flat stone above it, etched faintly with a tribal marking only Lonnie would know. Then they retreated into the canyon, their makeshift camp shielded by brush and shadow. Lonnie cleaned her rifle while Luke rechecked the copy in the canteen. Their plan relied on Creed's arrogance, that he'd never suspect anyone challenging him so close to the platform he planned to consecrate. Still, unease crackled between them. "You sure he'll show?" Lonnie asked. "Oh, he'll show," Luke said, running a whetstone down the edge of his knife. "Men like Creed never miss a chance to christen their own sins in champagne." Lonnie looked toward the mesa, her face unreadable. "If this fails," she said softly, "he'll win. Again." Luke met her gaze. Then we don't let it fail. They fell into a silence shaped by shared burden. No promises, no swelling speeches, just quiet understanding. The kind that builds not in days, but in choices. As dawn painted the canyon walls in hues of rust and rose, a train whistle echoed far off in the distance. The golden spike ceremony was just hours away. Lonnie tied her hair back tight. Luke loaded the last of their gear. They didn't smile. They didn't need to. Because today, truth had a witness, and liars were about to find out what lived beneath the rails. The first light hadn't yet stretched across Red Mesa when the ambush came. Lonnie had just returned from checking the canyon ridge, her boots leaving faint prints in the sand, when the snap of dry twigs behind her made her spin. Too late. 3 men, rough-faced and grinning like they were owed something, stepped from the rocks. "Well now," one said, swinging a short club across his palm, "ain't you early for the celebration?" Lonnie reached for her rifle, but another man was already there, boot pressing it to the ground. From the shadows, Luke surged forward, but a 4th man tackled him hard, slamming his ribs into the earth. In seconds, he was on his back, boot at his throat, arms pinned. "You should have stayed lost, Branner," one sneered, yanking Luke upright and punching him once, solid in the gut. They bound his wrists tight, shoved a gag between his teeth, and dragged him to a nearby tool shed, half buried in sand, stinking of old oil and rust. They threw him in like a sack of feed and bolted the door. Lonnie, though, was gone. Not captured, not killed. Gone. Creed's men searched for her an hour or more, shouting curses and overturning gear. They didn't know the land the way she did. Didn't know the ancient passage behind the ridge, marked by wind-carved stones and hollowed tree trunks. It was the same path her mother had once used when gathering root bundles from sacred ground. Lonnie hadn't needed a map to remember it. The land was the map. Inside the shed, Luke blinked sweat from his eyes, wrists aching from the cords. Blood trickled from his split lip. The sun climbed slow, cruel through a crack in the wall, drawing a gold line across the dirt floor. His chest burned where the boot had landed. But his mind was clear. He shifted, straining against the cords, and felt something press into his heel. He twisted his boot. Yes. The small nail he'd tucked in days ago slipped beneath the lining. One blessing from an old farrier who taught him that a good boot could hide more than leather. Luke worked the nail upward, clenched it between thumb and forefinger, and began sawing the rope slowly, rhythmically. Minutes passed. His breath came short, broken by pain, but he didn't stop. Outside, the platform was being dressed with bunting again. The spike ceremony was set to begin before noon. Creed, smug in a gray suit, paced the wooden stage, flanked by Marshall Haynes and a photographer with a tripod lens big enough to catch a lie from 50 paces. Just as the crowd began to gather, the rope around Luke's wrists frayed, then snapped. He didn't waste a second. He pushed open a side panel, half-rotted, and slipped out the back. His horse was gone, but a mule grazed nearby, tied lazily to a post. Luke threw himself onto its back, not caring about the limp or the pain. The beast protested, then charged forward, hooves thundering against the dry earth. Across the mesa, Lonnie crouched beneath a ledge, breathing shallow. Her hands were scratched, hair wild, but her eyes were steady. She clutched the treaty journal tight to her chest, counting every tick of the sun. When the crowd roared at Creed's entrance, she moved. Slipping through brush, staying low, she circled behind the platform. A second entrance, hidden behind crates of nails and folded canvas, would get her within striking distance of the stage. She paused once, just long enough to whisper a name, her mother's. Then she crawled forward, the weight of justice in her hands. Meanwhile, dust exploded on the horizon. Luke, bruised and bleeding, rode bareback into view, hat gone, shirt torn, one hand gripping the mule's reins like a lifeline. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man with nothing left to lose. The crowd turned. The hammer in Creed's hand froze midair, and Lonnie stood up, eyes locked on the platform. They'd made it. Not clean, not whole, but ready. Because truth doesn't wait for a grand entrance. It walks in when someone refuses to stay silent. The crowd at the base of Red Mesa was thick with dust and expectation. Men in city suits fanned themselves beside women in wide-billed hats, all craning to see the platform where Silas Creed stood like a preacher at a tent revival. Creed raised the golden hammer high, sunlight dancing off its head. Behind him, the bridge stretched out like a wound across the sacred land. "To progress," Creed proclaimed, his voice rich and oily. "To the future." That's when the shouting started. Heads turned. Lonnie pushed through the crowd, her dress torn at the hem, dirt smudging her cheeks, but her eyes locked forward like an arrow already loosed. She climbed the steps of the platform, the treaty journal in hand, her breath coming in sharp, fast bursts. Silence swept the crowd like a wind over wheat. Creed lowered the hammer, his smile faltering. "Miss, this is a private—" She cut him off. "My name is Lonnie, daughter of Mirabelle Two Feathers. This land, Red Mesa, was protected by treaty, signed by your hand, Mr. Creed. I carry that record today." She opened the journal and pulled a folded paper from within, holding it high for all to see. Her voice wavered, but her hands never did. "This," she said, "is the original agreement, signed in good faith, promising that no track, no steel, no spike would ever cross this land. And this," she unfolded. "Another is the notarized copy with the county seal." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marshal Haynes stepped forward, hand on his pistol. "She's a fugitive." "Not today," came another voice, strong, steady. Luke stepped onto the platform, his limp pronounced, shirt bloodied at the shoulder, but jaw firm. He held the forged deed and the signature page, retrieved from beneath the platform hours earlier. "Folks," he said, "my name's Luke Branner. I was there when she was tied down like a dog. I've seen the truth buried in creek beds and shed walls, and I dug it out." He handed the documents to the judge in the crowd, a wiry man with thick glasses and a reputation for knowing every clause in the book. The judge examined them in silence. Then he nodded. Once. "These are authentic." Gasps followed. A woman clutched her husband's arm. A young boy dropped his small wooden flag. Creed stepped back. "This is absurd. This land was unused. That treaty's not binding." "The clause reads," Lonnie said firmly, "that Red Mesa shall remain untouched, under pain of forfeiture, unless renegotiated by tribal consent." Luke looked out over the crowd. There was no renegotiation, only bulldozers and bribes. The judge held up the paper again. "If this is valid, and it appears to be, then Mr. Creed has no legal right to continue construction, and any expansion through Red Mesa constitutes a federal violation." Creed's face turned blotchy, anger rising like steam from a kettle. "You think this changes anything?" Lonnie held her mother's journal close to her chest. "It already has." A quiet hush settled, the kind that doesn't come from spectacle, but from truth, finally spoken aloud. Then came the drawings. Lonnie unrolled a second bundle, crude maps sketched by local children she'd taught in the canyons. They showed Red Mesa, the ancestral springs, the burial stones. They weren't legal evidence, they weren't proof, but they were memory. They were home. People in the crowd began to stir. Some nodded, others took a step, back from Creed. Even Marshal Haynes lowered his hand from his gun. The judge turned to Creed. "I suggest you pause this ceremony." Creed didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. Behind them, the golden spike, meant to seal Creed's legacy, lay untouched on its velvet cushion. And beside it stood a girl whose voice had once been silenced. Not anymore. Because the loudest hammer falls silent when the truth finally speaks. And justice, once awakened, doesn't forget where it's buried. The golden spike never touched the rail. By late afternoon, Creed's entourage had thinned like storm clouds losing nerve. The bunting flapped forgotten in the breeze, the velvet cushion left alone on the podium. A photographer quietly packed his camera without taking a single portrait. Silas Creed stood stiff on the platform, jaw clenched, watching the crowd scatter like dry brush in wind. A man in a gray vest, one of Creed's investors, stepped forward. "You swore this land was clear." Creed didn't. Answer? He adjusted his gloves instead, as if the act of control might buy back the hour. "We staked $2 million on this project," the man's voice turned sharp. "And you built on sand." Creed opened his mouth to speak, but another voice cut in, firm, unmoved. "She warned you?" It was Luke. He stood beside Lonnie at the foot of the platform, shoulders squared, though his limp dragged with each step. His voice didn't rise, but it carried. "She brought you the truth. You just chose not to see it. Marshal Haynes, hands loose at his sides, muttered, "Reckon I never liked that route anyhow." He gave Creed a final glance, then walked off without another word. A deputy followed, silent. Even the judge had left, taking the treaty and the forged deed for safe holding. What remained now was dust, disbelief, and Red Mesa, untouched beyond the new platform. Lonnie looked out over the land. The silence held weight, not emptiness. A sacred hush, like breath held in reverence. Creed turned, barked to one of his remaining men. "Get the cart. We're leaving." "Mr. Creed," came a soft voice. He paused. Lonnie stepped forward, holding the deed Luke had placed in her hand just moments ago. Her fingers were calloused, ink-stained, and trembling slightly, though her voice stayed steady. "You've done enough here, but there's a chance to walk away without digging deeper." Creed laughed, dry and bitter. "You want mercy?" She shook her head. "No, I want you gone, but I don't want your name on this land. Not now, not ever." Creed narrowed his eyes. "And what would you do with it?" She looked out over the mesa again. "Guard it. Teach its story. Make sure no one forgets what happened here." Creed said nothing more. He climbed into his waiting cart, yanked the reins, and disappeared over the horizon. Just like that, after months of deceit and ambition, he rode off with nothing. But he wasn't the only one changed. The next day, the town began to move with a quiet rhythm. Hammers rang as townsfolk helped disassemble the stage. Children returned, curious and smiling, handing Lonnie pebbles from the dry creek bed, asking if they were from the old path. Lonnie kept the drawings, the ones from the trial, and tacked them to a board near the canyon trail. "This is where we begin," she told them. Some called her Miss Lonnie, others just Teacher. Luke watched from the shade, arms crossed, one leg propped on a stone. He didn't say much, but the way he leaned forward when she spoke said more than words could. That evening, Lonnie stood beside him, gazing across the crimson plateau. He held something wrapped in cloth and tied with leather string. She unwrapped it. A small metal key and a folded deed. "What's this?" "Backlot," Luke said, "just beyond the east trail. Not much to it, bit of scrub, but water runs close in spring." Lonnie blinked. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because you'll keep it safer than anyone I know." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled. Not wide, not proud, just steady. "Then I will." Behind them, the last team of the platform boards were hauled away. The golden spike, now tarnished and dented, was buried beneath a cairn of river stones by a few kids who decided it wasn't worth keeping shiny things that came from lies. Red Mesa stood quiet, but not alone. Because some victories ain't loud, some come in quiet footfalls, gentle hands, and promises kept beneath an open sky. Red Mesa turned golden just before dusk. The sun, lazy in its descent, brushed the ridgelines in honeyed light, casting long shadows across the dry earth. No train whistles echoed here, no engines choked the air. Only the rustle of cottonwood leaves and the faint laughter of children riding bareback on shaggy ponies near the edge of the land. Lonnie stood near the edge of the trail, a woven satchel over one shoulder, her mother's journal now wrapped in deerskin and tucked safe within. The teaching board she'd nailed to a cedar post was covered in drawings, some maps, some memories. One child had sketched a crooked bridge, then scratched it out with red chalk. Underneath, they'd written, "We said no." Down the path, two boys were helping a third stack stones in the old way, wide at the base, narrow at the top, a silent promise that someone had been here and meant to return. Luke rode in quietly that evening, dust curling up around his boots as he dismounted. He still favored his left leg, but the bruises had faded. His hat sat low over his brow, and his saddlebag clinked faintly with whatever supplies he thought she might need. Lonnie saw him before he spoke. "You always come at the hour light hits the rock," she said softly. He shrugged, adjusting his reins. "Maybe the rock calls louder than I do." She smiled. "Maybe you just listen better than most." He looked out over the mesa. They're still talking about it in Cinder Butte, how one girl in one journal stopped 1,000 pounds of steel. "I didn't stop anything," she said. "I remembered what others forgot." Luke pulled something from his saddlebag. It was a box, carved from juniper wood and wrapped in twine. Inside, a tin of biscuits, dry but warm to the touch, and a folded map. He handed both over without ceremony. "What's this?" The biscuits, he said. Ain't much, but the map, he paused, shows where the spring feeds into the arroyo. Thought your students might want to know where the water begins. Lonnie's fingers lingered on the map. They'll trace it in charcoal, she said, and walk it in bare feet. Luke nodded. That's the way to know a place. Skin to soil. A small voice piped up from behind them. A girl, maybe 7, maybe 8, stood holding a handful of wildflowers. She looked at Luke, head tilted. You kin? Lonnie glanced at Luke, then back to the girl. She answered gently. No, just the kind that stops when someone's tied down. The girl nodded, like that made sense, then handed her flowers to Lonnie and skipped off, humming something sweet and old. Luke smiled, the kind that crept in slow like morning sun through a half-cracked shutter. You'll do. All right out here, he said. Lonnie met his eyes. You'll visit? I reckon. Fences need fixing now and then. Kids need stories. And, he glanced at the ridge, some tracks ain't meant to be laid, just followed. The wind stirred again, high and dry but soft. It carried no smoke now, no scent of oil or steel, just dust and cedar and whatever made the land whole again. Luke climbed into the saddle and tipped his hat. Till next time. Safe ride, she replied. As he rode off, his figure shrinking into the horizon, Lonnie turned back toward the clearing. The children were gathering by the board, waiting for her voice. She stepped forward, journal in hand. We begin with memory, she told them, and they listened. Because some stories aren't written in books. They're held in dirt and breath, and the spaces where iron rails never touched. Some endings don't come with banners, they come with roots, and a quiet that stays.